What if the thing God gave you to serve others slowly became the thing you needed to prove that you mattered? Nobody sets out to make their spiritual gift an idol. That is not how it happens. It starts with genuine service. Real fruit. People are genuinely helped. And then, without realizing, something shifts. Not in what you are doing, but in what the doing has become to you. Here is the question that reveals everything. When there is nothing to do for God, no one to help, no platform to serve on, or no gift being exercised, what does that feel like? Because the answer to that question tells you more about where your identity actually lives than almost anything else. This is the inner atlas, where we map the inner life. And today, I want to explore something that can happen even with something genuinely given by God. In the beginning, it is pure. You discover something God has placed in you, and you use it to serve. Someone is helped. Someone is healed. Someone hears something through you that they needed to hear. And it is beautiful because it is genuinely not about you yet. And then the affirmation starts coming. God really used you. I don't know what I would do without your counsel. Nobody else sees things the way you do. Each one is sincere and appreciated. But something you do not notice in the moment is also happening. You are beginning to need it. Not just receiving it, needing it. Serving starts feeling like the most alive you ever feel. Which is not entirely wrong. Using what God placed in you should feel natural. But there is a version of that aliveness that is healthy and a version that is subtly telling you something else. The version that makes you feel like yourself. And the version that makes you feel like yourself only when you are performing. Then someone else rises, and you notice something in yourself that you genuinely did not expect. A tightening somewhere in your chest. A quiet question about where you rank. Maybe even a search for reasons why what they have is different from what you have. And the discomfort of noticing that in yourself is real because you know it does not belong there. Or the season simply goes quiet, not because anything is wrong, just quieter, less activity, fewer people asking. And you discover that quiet does not feel like rest. It feels like you are shrinking. Like the less you are doing, the less you are. And that feeling right there is worth paying close attention to. The psychology underneath this is more revealing. Every human being naturally builds identity around whatever makes them feel significant. For most people, that is career, appearance, achievement, or status. For someone who genuinely loves God, something subtler can happen. The gift becomes the thing. Not obviously, gradually. The category of what I do quietly absorbs the category of who I am. And once those two things collapse into each other, the gift is no longer just something you have. It is something you need. There is a distinction here that sounds almost identical at face value, but points to completely different foundations. I am valuable because God uses me. That sounds deeply spiritual. But what it quietly does is make usefulness the evidence of worth. If God stops using you in a visible way, the equation breaks down. The healthier version says, I am valuable because I belong to God, and therefore I can freely use whatever He has given me. One foundation holds when the gift goes quiet, the other one does not. Spiritual gifts can create a reinforcement cycle that, in itself, is not unhealthy. The gift is used, people respond. That response brings a sense of significance and encouragement, and that can increase the desire to serve again. In a healthy cycle, the joy of being useful leads back into service. The danger is when the emotional reward, that is, the feeling of mattering, starts becoming the reason. The person is still serving and still genuinely helping people, but internally, the motivation has quietly shifted, and from the outside, nobody can tell the difference. And this is where the pattern takes a more serious turn. The person gradually loses the ability to experience themselves apart from performance. They stop asking, who am I, and start asking, what do I do? And sooner or later, the question is no longer about the gift itself. It becomes, what happens if I cannot do it anymore? That is an identity crisis, not a ministry challenge. And the difference between those two things matters enormously for how you find your way through it. Spiritual gifts carry a particular psychological vulnerability because they can feel like confirmation from God in a way that other sources of identity may not. The thought itself may be perfectly legitimate. God chose me for this. And that may genuinely be true. But the heart can unconsciously attach a conclusion to that truth that does not actually follow. Therefore, I must be especially important. Being entrusted with something and being elevated above others are not the same thing. In fact, biblical stewardship moves in the opposite direction. Greater trust brings greater responsibility, not greater status. If you recognize something of yourself in this, you are not alone in having to examine it. Romans chapter 12, verse 6 gives us the first and most important thing to understand about spiritual gifts. Paul writes, "We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us." The Greek word for gift here, charisma, shares its root with charis, the word for grace, which means before the gift is anything else, it is grace. You did not generate it. You did not earn it. You received it from a generous God. That one word, grace, changes the entire posture, because you cannot boast about what you were given, and Paul gives us the purpose of that gift. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, he says the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. Not for personal validation, not as a mark of spiritual advancement, for the common good. The gift has a destination, and that destination is not you. An idolized gift turns that direction around. Instead of flowing outward, it gets absorbed inward. And when that happens, the gift stops serving its purpose, even when it still looks like it is working. The church at Corinth is one of the most important biblical case studies for this topic. And what makes it so powerful is that Paul does not say their gifts were fake. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 5 to 7, he tells them they were enriched in Christ in speech and knowledge and were not lacking in any spiritual gift. They were genuinely gifted. But then in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 1, he calls them infants in Christ. And his reason is not that their gifts failed them. It is that their gifts had become entangled with jealousy, division, competition, and status. God was working among them, and they were still not mature. Both things were true at the same time. Paul addresses the gifts directly in 1 Corinthians chapters 12 to 14. The Corinthians had genuine spiritual activity, but their gatherings were becoming disorderly. So Paul keeps bringing them back to a more important question. Does what you're doing actually build up the body? He makes the implication unmistakable in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 12 through 27. The eye does not need to become the hand, and the hand does not need to become the foot. Each has a different function, but neither has a different worth. Your gift may be different from someone else's without making you more important than them. And right in the middle of that discussion, he writes something in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 1 to 3 that should stop every gifted person in their tracks. He says that if someone speaks in the tongues of angels, has prophetic powers, understands all mysteries, has all knowledge, has faith that can move mountains, and gives everything they own to the poor, but does not have love, it amounts to nothing. Not less than it could be? Nothing. That is not hyperbole. That is the most direct thing Paul could say. Spiritual power is not the same as Christ-like character. The gift shows what God has enabled you to do. Love reveals what kind of person you are becoming while you do it. Jesus gives an even more sobering warning. In Matthew chapter 7, verses 22 and 23, people point to what they did in his name, prophecy, and performing powerful works. Yet Jesus tells them that activity itself is not proof of relationship with him. You can become deeply invested in what you do for God while becoming disconnected from God himself. King Saul's story shows us what happens when calling becomes fused with personal significance over time. His leadership gradually became entangled with insecurity, with comparison, with an obsessive concern about how people perceived him relative to David. And the question driving his anguish was not really about David at all. It was, if David is celebrated more than me, what does that make me? That is the exact question that forms when a gift has become an identity. Someone else's increase feels like your decrease. Acts chapter 8 introduces a figure named Simon who sees the apostles ministering in the power of the Spirit and immediately wants the ability for himself. He even offers money for it. And Peter's response exposes the problem at its root. Simon's heart was not right before God. What Simon wanted was not God. He wanted what God could do through him. That distinction cuts to the center of this entire conversation. Wanting to be used by God is not automatically the same as wanting God. Moses shows us the right relationship between gift and giver. He performed extraordinary signs. He carried extraordinary authority. And yet in Exodus chapter 33, verse 15, he says, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here." The one non-negotiable for Moses was God's presence, not what God did through him, God himself. That is the posture that keeps a gift from becoming an idol. When the giver matters more than the gift stays in its right place. Paul himself becomes another example of the very posture he teaches. He says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 10, "By the grace of God I am what I am." Paul had extraordinary authority, revelation, gifts, and ministry, but he understood all of it as received, not as proof that he was inherently more important. And Jesus remains the clearest picture of all: perfect knowledge, divine authority, unique relationship with the Father. Every possible basis for feeling above others, he had it. And John chapter 13 shows him kneeling on the floor, washing his disciples' feet, the night before he was crucified. Mark chapter 10, verse 45 gives us why. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. In Christ, the greatest possible authority became the most complete service. Power and humility were never opposites in him, and they were never supposed to be in us either. Now we can look at this from a different angle. The gift was never given to show how valuable you are. It was given to show how generous God is. That is not a small distinction. If the gift is about your value, you have to protect, prove, and perform it constantly. But if the gift is about God's generosity, you just have to steward it. And stewardship is a completely different way to live. It is lighter. It does not need recognition to keep moving. When identity rests in belonging to God rather than in being used by God, something changes. You can celebrate someone else's gifting without it feeling threatening. You can enter a quiet season without believing you have become irrelevant. You can serve without needing the serving to confirm that you matter. Recall what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 10, "By the grace of God I am what I am." Not by what he accomplished or by how often he was used. By grace. That is the foundation that holds when everything else goes quiet. Go back to the question from the beginning. When there is nothing to do for God, what does that feel like? Because the goal is not to reach a place where the gift no longer matters. It is to reach a place where the stillness does not feel like loss, where you can sit in a quiet room and still know exactly who you are. Not because of what you have done, but because of whose you are. Sit with that for a moment. And as you do, it might help just to be honest with what's coming up for you right now, without trying to fix it or explain it away. Take whatever this has stirred in you back into prayer. Even if it's just a simple, honest conversation with God about where you are and what you're still trying to understand. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing for more conversations about identity, growth, faith, and the deeper patterns shaping our lives. And if you think someone else needs this, feel free to share it with them. I'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What part stayed with you the most? And before you go, there are a couple more reflections waiting for you here on the screen. They explore different parts of the human experience that may resonate with you too. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next reflection.